All right, I think we'll probably get started. It's a little bit after 3. So thank you all for coming. You made a very wise choice to come to the panel on Bois Forte. My name is Jeff Holth. I'm a shareholder at Jacobson Law Group in St. Paul. We're a native-owned law firm that does representation of tribal governments and tribal enterprises. We really take pride in kind of long-standing relationships in Indian country with clients, and so one of our most long-standing relationships has been with Bois Forte Band of Chippewa in northern Minnesota. Our firm serves as general counsel for Bois Forte, and it's I think been that case for almost 30 years. So it's a real privilege to represent Bois Forte, and that's kind of my part of this small part. I'm sort of going to be the moderator and set up the discussion today, but the 3 individuals to the right of me are going to be the main presenters. But I was fortunate enough to kind of work with a partner of mine, Joe Halloran, in our office, and work with all the stakeholders on this really significant Bois Forte land restoration project that occurred last year. So the goal today, we were talking a little bit last night about sort of takeaways, and I think the goal today is really just to present the story of the Bois Forte's land restoration. To give a broad overview from sort of the key stakeholders and how the purchase and the restoration came to be, so that you can, hopefully take a piece of it that's of value to you, bring it back to your community, and sort of take whatever value is most relevant to you. So really, I think we'll just sort of be telling the story today about how this came to be, and what we think is a really unique and pretty fantastic project. So I'll introduce, what I'll do is I'll run through kind of the basics of what was the purchase, a little bit of history behind it, the scope of it, put some maps up, set the stage a little bit before turning it over to the other 3 panelists, but I'll introduce them first. So directly to the right of me is Chairwoman Cathy Chavers. So for over 30 years, Cathy has served the Bois Forte Band of Chippewa, focusing on healthcare before shifting her career to politics. In 2008, she kicked off her political career as the District 1 representative of the Bois Forte Reservation Tribal Council. And in April of 2016, she was elected tribal chairwoman. Cathy has had the honor to hold seats on various committees, forums, and councils. Currently, she is the first female president of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, the Bemidji area representative for the National Indian Health Service Budget Forum, and a member of the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council. Results First and the St. Louis County Public Health and Human Services Advisory Board. One of her goals as chairwoman is to be honest and accountable leader to the tribal members of Bois Forte. She aspires to provide positive direction for economic and workforce development while incorporating more culture and language back into the reservation. Next to Cathy is Kim Berns. Kim is the state director for Minnesota with the Conservation Fund, a national nonprofit conservation organization that was established in 1985. Kim joined the Conservation Fund in 2018 after retiring from 40 years of federal service and having served in 5 different federal agencies throughout the United States and in Washington, D.C. Most of Kim's career was spent with the U.S. Forest Service, where she started as a forester out of college and worked in 7 different national forests in 4 regions, as well as in the national headquarters location. Throughout her career, both inside and out of federal service, Kim has worked closely with tribes and tribal nations on a variety of land acquisition projects and other land-related projects that have benefited tribes. And finally, I will introduce Cris Stainbrook. Cris Stainbrook in Oglala, Lakota, is president of the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, which has provided over $100 million of grants and services over the past 20 years to Indian nations and individual Indian people, focusing on recovering land within reservation boundaries to Indian ownership and management. He's also board chair of the Indian Land Capital Company, a CDFI subsidiary of ILTF. Prior to ILTF, Cris was the senior program officer at Northwest Area Foundation. He served on the boards of the St. Paul and Minnesota Community Foundations, Grotto Foundation, and ACLU of Minnesota. He currently serves on the board of the U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Communities, and Earlier in his career, he worked on economic and community development with Pacific Northwest tribes and Native Alaska villages. Cris holds a master's degree in fisheries science from Oregon State University. So, I will, like I said, set the stage for the Bois Forte land restoration and then hand the mic over to the much more experienced and more informed panelists to my right. All right. So, what happened? Very, very broadly. Last year, on June 7th specifically, Bois Forte restored over 28,000 acres of on-reservation forest land to tribal ownership through a purchase from the Conservation Fund. We'll talk in a lot of detail about how this came to be, what Bois Forte did to ensure that there was revenue to be able to fund the purchase, and the details of the programs that will serve as that revenue generator. But that's the very high level description of what happened. And the picture to the right is the day of the actual restoration on June 7th out. I think that's Nett Lake in the background, right? Yeah. Okay, so I think this really brings to life the scope of the purchase and the restoration and its significance to Bois Forte. So the map on the left is a map that shows in the top right the Nett Lake sector of the Bois Forte Reservation. Bois Forte has 3 different sectors of the reservation that are separated: the Vermilion Reservation, Nett Lake, and Deer Creek. So on the left is the Nett Lake in the top right sector, and the bottom left there, across the Itasca County border, is the Deer Creek sector of the Bois Forte Reservation. So all of the land in the sort of the dark red maroon in those areas, it represents the land that was purchased and restored as a part of this project. So in the Nett Lake Reservation, nearly 28,524 acres restored on the Deer Creek Reservation. So obviously you can see the land in sort of the green is existing trust land that was prior to this acquisition in trust. And so you can see, effectively the purchase almost nearly doubled the tribal ownership on reservation for Nett Lake, which is the largest sector of the Bois Forte Reservation. To the right is just the Nett Lake sector of the reservation, and again, the red represents the land restored through this purchase. The sort of the X'd green is the trust land. And another interesting piece of this is Bois Forte looks to continue acquiring and eventually, continuing acquiring tribal ownership within the reservation. A big portion of the land that is not in tribal ownership is that pink shaded land, which is tax forfeited land that is held by the state and managed by the county, which is, we could probably do a whole nother panel on, in Minnesota, sort of the method and strategies of getting tax forfeited land back to tribal ownership. But it's definitely, I think, something that will probably come up on the horizon as part of Bois Forte's efforts. So admittedly, this is a timeline that is pretty reductive in that we're talking about over 150 years from the 1866 treaty that Bois Forte signed up to the June 2022 restoration in 5 bullet points. But this gives you like a very broad detail of sort of the key pieces that led up to this restoration that I'm sure the chairwoman will talk about some of the history in more detail. So in the 1866 treaty is the treaty under which Bois Forte reserved the Nett Lake and Deer Creek sectors of its reservation. And some of the language in a further slide talks about this being a permanent homeland, an undisturbed homeland for Bois Forte band members. And then obviously, not uncommon to a lot of tribal communities across the country, very recently, or very soon after the treaty is executed, you have what in Minnesota was the Nelson Act, was effectively an allotment act that really allotted the lands and led to significant rapid division of ownership of on-reservation lands. So we have what now everyone is pretty familiar, at least in this room, with the checkerboard effect of an array of ownership of lands across the reservation, some of which might be tribal ownership, but a lot of which is not. And through a series of subsequent purchases, a company called Potlatch-Deltic ends up owning a significant portion of the land on Bois Forte's reservation. Potlatch-Deltic is a significant national timber company. Kim will talk about this in a little more detail, but in 2020, the Conservation Fund purchases the remaining Potlatch-Deltic land in Minnesota. So that includes the land that Bois Forte purchased from the Conservation Fund, but also significant acres of land outside of the reservation as well within greater Minnesota. And in June of 2022, Bois Forte purchases all of that former Potlatch-Deltic land within its reservation from the Conservation Fund. So not from Potlatch-Deltic, but from the Conservation Fund, through a loan from the Indian Land Capital Company, which is a subsidiary of ILTF. And Cris will talk a little bit more about that piece, which is obviously huge, which was the financing piece and how that worked with Bois Forte. So very high level, one of the big challenges obviously was Bois Forte did not have a stack of cash laying around to purchase this, land outright, to purchase 28,000 plus acres of land. So how, what could the band do to be able to get this land restored, but also do it in a way that was actually economically feasible to be able to make the purchase? And as at a high level, there was a loan. Bois Forte secured a loan, like I said, through the Indian Land Capital Company to be able to make the actual purchase and meet the purchase price for the conveyance of the land. But then to pay off the loan amount, to pay off the loan payments, the band is relying right now on the Minnesota Sustainable Forest Incentive Act. So all of the land was already enrolled in this act, which is an act unique to Minnesota. And the act basically incentivizes maintaining forest lands undeveloped and basically in forest management activities, and covenanting to basically retain the land in that status in exchange for the state providing the landowner, the band in this case, with incentive payments per acre. So right now, all of the land purchased through the Conservation Fund purchase is enrolled in what I'll call SEFA. This is Minnesota Sustainable Forest Incentive Act. And the band is able to get incentive payments through that program that in large part will cover the loan payments in the future. In addition to that, the band is now exploring a carbon credit program as well for the land. And so it's possible to enroll this land in the SEFA program and also have a carbon credit program stacked on top of that. And a carbon credit program could provide additional revenue on top of the SEFA incentive payments that will allow additional aggressive payback of the loan, and the real ultimate goal of providing additional revenue for the band to be able to not only pay off the loan, but then move money towards further land acquisition efforts and things like that. So the high level takeaway for funding the purchase was that the band was able to utilize revenue that would flow from the land itself, and critically keeping the land in the state that the band intended to in the first place, undeveloped and managed in a conservation-based way, and still get revenue from it that would pay off the purchase price, which is really a win-win. One quick thing to note about the SEFA program too is that the program allows for an exit if the land is ever acquired by an authority for public purpose that has eminent domain authority. So if the band in the future decides to put the land into trust, it can exit from the CFA program, release that covenant attached to the land, and still get the land transferred into trust in the future if the band decides to do that. All right, last slide for me, which I think is a kind of a real important takeaway for me about this story and this project is I feel like it's rare to have all the major players in such a significant acquisition at the table with really the same true mission to support land restoration and tribal sovereignty, and not just in word, but in action. So here we had Bois Forte's leadership and council, despite the fact that it was dealing with COVID and so many other sorts of tribal government issues and enterprise issues that could be really distracting. They still had this commitment to this long overarching project that would eventually restore this land and maintain that commitment throughout it. You had the Conservation Fund's commitment to returning the land to its rightful steward, right? Which was absolutely essential to make this all happen. The Conservation Fund's commitment to taking this significant land, saying, we're going to offer this to you, Bois Forte, and we're going to offer to you in a way that's economically feasible for you to purchase. And then the Indian Land Tenure Foundation and Indian Land Capital Company's commitment to finance it. Finance it in a way that was structured so the band could do it. And I added this too because I think it's important. I mean, the loan is not secured by a mortgage on the land. It's secured by the full faith and credit of the band. So, the commitment to promoting tribal land restoration trickled down to even those terms of saying we're not even going to issue a mortgage against the land. We're going to issue it against the full faith and credit so that we are truly committed to you maintaining this land. So that's all I'll say. I'll turn it over to Cathy next, and thanks again for being here, and I appreciate being able to share the story.
Anin Buju, Cathy Chavers, Indigenakaz Good afternoon, I'm Cathy Chavers. I'm the tribal chairwoman of Bois Forte. And I just kind of want to give a little brief history of Bois Forte because we're actually, I like to say the Cinderella story with regards to land acquisition because we're a very small tribe. And we're located in northern Minnesota, 50 miles from the Canadian border. Our total enrollment is 3,500. And we have one little bitty casino that's not on a major thoroughfare. It's a destination resort casino, so we only generate a small amount of revenue through our casino. We do the same as all the other tribal governments, provide the services and whatever, and use our casino revenue to provide for our programs and services, for that funding gap that we have through the federal government. And like Jeff said, when we were established in 1866 with Net Lake, the square map that you saw, basically what happened, because my great-grandpa was actually working with the timber companies when they came in. And Bois Forte, for example, the definition of Bois Forte is strong wood. So in our Ojibwe term, our name is Men of the Strong Fir Wood. And so basically it's all trees where we live. And then when my great-grandpa was working with the timber companies, that's where he learned a little bit of English. And he knew what the timber companies were going to do when they came on the reservation and they wanted to acquire the land for their benefit. And so they went around asking all the tribal members, do you want us, in English and speaking Ojibwe back then, I don't think a lot of people understood what was going on. They bartered, I'm sure, for either goods or money or alcohol or whatever it may be. But a lot of people sold their land. And my grandpa didn't. He told my grandma, no, we're not going to do it, because he understood a little bit about that. But we have in that square that you saw, we have about 106,000 acres in that square. Out of that 106,000 acres, about 60% of it we don't own. We only own about 40%. before this acquisition. And so we have private landowners. We had the timber industries. We still have some timber industries in there right now that the Conservation Fund is still trying to get that land back, and county land and what have you. So we knew that potlatch was there, and we were working with potlatch as a tribe because they came up to us and said, we're going to leave Minnesota and we want to move south because trees grow faster in the south than they do in Minnesota. And we said, okay, all right, so we'll sit down and meet with you about this 28,000 acres of land. And we did, and we were figuring at least $1,000 an acre. And we thought, oh boy, you know, we're small, we don't have the revenue. So what we did is when we found out the amount of acreage and we got the map, and we sat down with our realty, our DNR, the tribal leaders, everybody involved, and we went through our map and tried to strategically pick the acres that we were going to purchase first. Hunting areas, access areas, rivers and roads, cultural areas. And so we were strategically planning that. So it probably would have taken us, I don't know how long to do that, because really we didn't have the money. We're a small tribe. We have about 500 people that live in our community in Net Lake. We have about 500 people that live in our community in Lake Vermilion, which is in Tower, Minnesota. Those are 65 miles apart, those two sectors. And so, you know, we were really perplexed, but we had a plan. And we figured we could purchase maybe $1 million worth of acreage per year, which would take us many years to do that. Then one day, I got a call, and it was from Kim Berns here. And she said who she was, and that she was with the Conservation Fund, and that they had purchased all of the potlatch Deltic lands. And I said, that's great. And she said, our goal is eventually to ensure that the tribe will get this land back. Do you want to meet? And of course we said definitely. And so we met with Kim, and she gave us a lot of history. When Jeff mentioned the Sustainable Forest Initiative Act, or SEFA, through Minnesota, what Potlatch had done in 2016 is they enrolled their land into the SEFA program for 50 years. It has to be in the SEFA program for 50 years in order to be eligible for the annual payments from the state. And so, and the amount per acre at that time when we were meeting with Kim was $20.19 per acre. So when you do the math, that's almost $500,000 a year that you get for that land through the SEFA. And so we weren't aware of that, and we thought, wow, that's a golden opportunity for us. Well, then Kim brought in Cris, and Cris came in and met with us, and we started talking about how can we finance this project. And Cris said, I think we can find the donations or the lenders to do this. He said, so we move forward with it. The Tribal Council, one of our highest priorities is getting our land back. Because like you saw, we're really a checkerboard reservation like most are. And a lot of our tribal members don't understand that, because when we go deer hunting on the reservation, they're wondering why these, and I don't mean to sound offensive, but these non-Indians are hunting on the reservation. Well, they don't understand they own some of the property that's within the reservation boundaries. And so it does cause some problems at times. But anyway, so we met, and we met numerous times, and came up with a plan, got our legal involved. And the one thing I really want to say about this whole project had nothing to do with the federal government. This whole project took about 1.5 years, and it was done. We just recently, we wanted to well, we all know how the BIA is in the federal government, right? Takes a long time for anything to get done. And a prime example of that for Bois Forte is our jail agreement. We are a non-public law 280 tribe. So we have the BIA as our law enforcement. We have to travel 4 hours to bring our prisoners to a jail, one way. We wanted a local county to do our jail agreement. It took us 6 years to have those documents signed. and a contract written up. 6 years for a simple jail agreement. So you can imagine what this land process would have been like had we had to go through the federal government. The one thing that Bois Forte's been really adamant about is because we are a small tribe, because we have limited resources, because we don't make oodles of money, and a lot of you know about the Shakopee Mdewakanton Sioux tribe in Minnesota. They're the second richest tribe in the nation, or the first, whatever it may be, but we're just totally opposite. We're not that. And so sometimes the perspective of tribes and gaming is, oh, you make lots of money. Well, not the smaller rural tribes. We struggle. We struggle very hard, and the pandemic really hit hard, especially when you're by the Canadian border and the government shut the Canadian border down, and they shut people coming down too. That was a lot of our people. So for the smaller tribes, it's really tough. And trying to do all we can for our tribal members has been challenging, very challenging for us as tribal leaders. So we sat down and we met, and Kim came up with a plan that she had to get the land assessed at a value that would work for both the conservation fund and the tribe, and that happened. And then, we gave that figure to Cris, and he came up with some funding. He pulled out his checkbook. No, I'm kidding. He came in with the funding, and this project happened, and we got 28,000 of our acres back. So right now we own about 73,000 acres within that 106,000 on the Net Lake side of the reservation, which is huge for us because, first of all, it's all timber, most of it, and we weren't going to develop that land anyway. Second is we're getting paid to do nothing with our land, but just manage the forests, which we do. We do that anyway. We have a great forestry department, and they do manage our forests in a good way. And so, and next now is the carbon credits. We have an opportunity to even make more money through the carbon credits. So we aren't yet done with the carbon credits. We're about in year 2, I believe, of looking at that process. Yeah. We did the feasibility, and they're looking at the value and what Brian was talking about if you attended the carbon credit. We are involved with that, with our 28,000 acres. But anyway, it's a way for us to generate revenue without having any type of economic development to do it. For us, that's huge. And if you think about 50 years from 2016, well, we acquired the land this past year in 2022, so we still have about 44 years left of revenue from the state of Minnesota to just manage our forest lands. Well, that will pay off the loan, and the carbon credits will help pay off the loan. But what we've done as a tribe, and I don't mean to be disrespectful to tribal leaders either, but we know that when tribal councils get in different each term or each year, that sometimes those priorities change. Our tribal council passed a resolution where all 5 tribal council members have to approve what that money is going to be used for. It can't be a majority vote of 3-2. It has to be all 5. And what we've just decided to do once the loan is paid off is reinvest that into our Department of Natural Resources, in our realty and land buyback fund, so we can make sure that for the next 7 generations those resources are still there. We do berry picking, we do maple sugaring, we do the forest harvesting. A lot of people go out and get their traditional medicines from our forests, and so they're really extremely important to us in our neck of the woods. And, even a lot of non-Indians come to our spiritual elders and look for healing medicines for cancer patients and for those. So we do a lot of traditional medicines that help a lot of people. And so this whole idea was a godsend for Bois Forte. It just fell into our lap. We didn't ever think we would see it happen dealing with Potlatch, because they're a big timber company. We don't have that kind of money laying around. But when the conservation fund came in, it was like I said, a godsend, because we now have one of the largest land reclamation in the history of the United States by having that. And we're a small tribe located in the middle of nowhere, to be honest with you. I mean, we're so rural and isolated, and nobody knows where we are or who we are. But we're very proud of that fact because our land was taken from us. And we want it back for our people and for our next 7 generations. So very fortunate to be working with Cris and Kim. And also I want to thank Jeff for the legal aspect, because what took a year and a half about was one of the fastest processes I've seen move in Indian country, where there isn't counties or all these barriers for us to, or hurdles for us to go over. It went rather smoothly and quickly, and it was a good day for Bois Forte.
Thanks, Cathy. Good afternoon. I'm Kim Berns-Melhus. I'm the State Director for the Conservation Fund in Minnesota. And if you give me the clicker, how does it work? Just the right clicker. This right, okay. Just a little bit about the Conservation Fund and how we came to own this land, and then just give you some perspective on who we are and why this was important for us. So we were formed in 1985. We're small but mighty. We are really a real estate arm of the original founders of the Nature Conservancy. We have no membership, unlike the Nature Conservancy, and we just basically have expertise in doing land deals and have been doing it since 1985 and have saved almost 9 million acres of land throughout the United States. So we're just really efficient in the way we do things, and we do real estate deals is really what our bread and butter is. So kind of where we work all over the United States. We have offices in most of the states, but this gives you a perspective on some of the land deals that we have been involved with and the lands we've saved in each of those states. So you can kind of see that since 1985, we've spent almost, $7.5 billion to conserve almost 9 million acres. So pretty significant for a very small nonprofit organization. This is a quote from our CEO, Larry Seltzer, who was in the picture that Jeff had shown in the beginning. And really, we have a dual charter. And that dual charter is about economic development in concert with conservation. We think that those two things go hand in hand. So when we were working with Bois Forte, we looked at the economic development that they would gain from this land, as well as the conservation aspect. So this fit perfectly within our goals as an organization. This is just some of the work we have done around the country with tribes. This is just a short list of some of our work around the United States. And I do believe these PowerPoints will be available to you, so you can click on any of those projects and find out more about those. But this, working with Bois Forte was something that fit within our mission and the work that we do with tribes around the United States. So this is a really messy map, and what I want to focus your attention on is the red. The bright red is the 72,000 acres that this timber company in Minnesota had left in the state. At one time, they had over 300,000 acres. But we purchased all 72,000 acres of those, of what Potlatch, the timber company, had left in Minnesota. If you look in the top of the slide, in the bright red, in the square up there, that is the Bois Forte Reservation. And when we bought this land from Potlatch, we borrowed money from investors and used those funds and purchased the land as a working forest. We knew that these lands were important to Minnesota from the counties, the states, the tribes. And so we had a goal of 10 years to convey these lands back into, either state, county, or tribal ownership. And even internal to the Conservation Fund, we looked at Bois Forte and we said, hey, this would be great if they could own this land. But they don't have money. We talked to Potlatch. They tried to work with Bois Forte. We had anticipated that it'd take us about 10 years to convey these lands to not only the tribe, but to all the other entities. But I knew a guy, and that's Cris. And when I was talking to Bois Forte, and I had a lot of experience in working with tribes, I said, hey, I know this guy that works for Indian Land Tenure Foundation. What if we, had a plan? And so that's how it came to be. And so our role in this was, to work with Cris and talk with Cathy and her tribal council and make this happen in a much shorter time frame than what we had even anticipated. And with that, I'll turn it, this is just another display of what that 28,000 acres look like within Net Lake. I'll turn it over to Cris.
Yane Washte. So I'm Cris Stainbrook with the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. I had probably the easiest part of all of this, and that was all I had to do was make promises and then see who was going to be able to keep them. I would go back, I would get off of the phone, and I would go into R.J. Bronco's office, who's the CEO of Indian Land Capital Company, and tell him this is what we need. And he, of course, would offer up some rationale for capitalism. He keeps me on the capitalistic side sometimes. But when we got involved with the project, it was fairly early on, and we weren't, in fact, at that point, I don't think we even knew that there was this sustainable forestry initiative piece. And we found that out along the way and began thinking about, and then later we find out that, in fact, you can put a carbon project on top of those same lands, and that opened up a whole chest of opportunities for us. One of the other programs at the foundation is the National Indian Carbon Coalition, and that's the program director, Brian Van Stippen. He got similar instructions from me that he needed to figure this out and make it happen. For me, this project became kind of the holy grail of how do you get land back to a tribe and not have to have the tribe pay for it. And between the SFI payment, the carbon credits, and the correct financing, both in terms of time and rate, that could make the whole thing come together. And so for me, it was how do you chase this deal and get it done? And you can see this is just a list of financing for it. The forest initiative is up there. The conservation fund did all the upfront acquisition, and then we were financing the purchase from the conservation fund to the band. Shakopee Medwakadin came in with about $500,000 of upfront financing to get us through the early part of it. Indian Land Tenure Foundation, because our ILCC CEO is a true capitalist and has no intention of ever losing money, needed someone to back up the loan, and so we used part of our investment portfolio and set it aside for backing up the loan from ILCC to the band. And then we were essentially covering the first part of the loan if necessary, because it takes 2 years to get the carbon projects up and operating. And so the foundation made a line of credit to the band for that. And then we had the capital company for a 20-year note, and we are now working on the National Indian Carbon Coalition, and it looks like that's going to happen and will be sufficient, as Chairwoman Chavers said, it'll be sufficient to cover all of this. The one thing, and I know some people in the room have heard me say this, we don't like doing projects with any type of conditions on those projects to the tribes. We think it winnows away at sovereignty. And so in this case, the Sustainable Forestry Initiative has this 50-year piece on those lands. But as Jeff said earlier, it can be canceled. There were a number of the tribal council members who really were interested in, so if we get that paid off, we can close that part of the reservation to non-Indian hunters and fishermen. And so that's kind of, I think the package will get done sooner rather than 20 years by a good bit. And then the band members can have open access and free access to the reservation lands. So in a nutshell, that's the financing behind it.
If I could just add something to that, we mentioned that it's through the state's CFA program. We can't put that land into trust until that loan is paid. It has to stay under the state to get that money. And so that's kind of a drawback for us. But the other thing is that we can also, with the forest management, we still get the, with the logging and the timber and that, we still get the income from that as well. So it might not be a lot, but at least we still get that. So we thought it's worth it. Again, we didn't, I hate to say this, but we didn't pay a dime for this project. I want to thank the Shakopee Metawakan Sioux for their grant program because they helped us with the closing costs and also some of the upfront costs that were involved. But other than that, our tribe didn't have to pay anything to get 28,000 acres back. I wish more states would do this with their resources for tribes and also for others. The one thing being a small tribe is what we have to do is we have to have those collaborations and partnerships because we can't do it alone by ourselves because we're so small and we don't have the revenue needed to do all these projects we want to do. And so we've been very fortunate with ARPA and the CARES Act where we've really been adamant about accessing all the funds. This is kind of getting off a little bit of the land, but accessing all the funds that we can because we know the federal government, the money showers are going to end pretty soon, and we have to take advantage of that. So far, we've gotten over $85 million in grants just within the past 2 years under ARPA and CARES Act because we've been really adamant about getting that financing or that funding for projects. So I really want to plug that to you guys, that access all those grants as much as you can, whether it be in natural resources or wherever, because pretty soon that money's going to dry up. But I do want to thank my partners here because, like I said, being a small rural tribe with limited income, not a lot of people like to come to northern Minnesota to hunt and fish, but we're getting our revenue based on tourism, not on traffic. So we have to market ourselves, and it's a long destination in the middle of nowhere again, surrounded by trees. But we're very fortunate. And I just wish all the tribes could be as fortunate as we were, because I know that land is important to us, and that it was taken, and now we have to buy our own land back. That's really sad. That's very sad. But I just want to thank everybody here for helping Bois Forte because we wouldn't be where we are today without the work that Cris and Kim and even Jeff and what's his name again? Your guy? RJ. I was going to say PJ, but it's RJ. With RJ too, and even the Brian with the carbon credits, because they've opened our eyes to things that we weren't even aware of before. And so by having those partnerships and collaborations and reaching out to these agencies, because sometimes they won't reach out to you. But sometimes they will. So, miigwech. Yeah.
So one thing I should remind the chairwoman of is, yes, we do all of our lending on full faith and credit without taking a mortgage on the land, but we also kind of scan what the tribes have available. They have this great golf course, and should they fall behind, you can look for us doing a big tournament on this great golf course in Lake Vermilion. So
for that plug. Oh,
I was going to move to the picture of the, wait,
okay, I always say this wherever I speak, but in Minnesota, that's Bois Forte. That's our timber. But also, we have one lake that is on our map, and I don't know if it's not there. But anyway, it's Net Lake, and that's where we have our wild rice. And I always say this with all the 11 or 10 other tribes in Minnesota, we have the best wild rice in the country. I see you shaking your head back there. No. But our lake, we don't allow motorboats on our lake because we don't want chemicals in it. And so our elders take charge of the lake. We had to do a fish count on our lake one year and, shock the fish to see how they were, and we had to get permission from the elders to do that. We traveled to Net Lake to where the food grows on the water. That's why we're there, because of the wild rice. And so Minnesota has a large issue with wild rice right now. We're also Bois Forte was established by the 1854 treaty area, which we had 6 million acres of land in that treaty area. And right now we can only use 20% for hunting, fishing, and gathering because of mining. We have iron ore mining in our treaty area, and we're fighting to retain that 20% that we have. We have a ski resort that's trying to get 600 acres to enhance their ski resort, and it's one of the largest maple sugaring stands in the state of Minnesota. And we're working with the U.S. Forest Service on that, and it looks like hopefully we will get to retain that land. We're still working on that, but that's the fight that we have every day as tribes, is fighting for those issues that we have, whether it be land, water, or whatever resources, our kids. So I just wanted to say that too. I can talk forever. I was given the gift of gab, so thank you.
All right, I think that kind of concludes the formal presentation part. Thank you, Chairwoman, Kim, Cris, for all the helpful insight. And again, like I said at the beginning, I think just telling the story, hopefully there's something of value you can take from it. CFA and that revenue stream doesn't exist in all states, but at the same time, there are options. And I think being creative and partnering with organizations, really fantastic things can happen.
Can I say one more thing?
Of course you can.
One thing I want to say with the state of Minnesota, when you hear about the Sustainable Forest Initiative Act, we have 11 tribes in Minnesota, 4 Dakota and 7 Ojibwe, and we have tribal liaisons, tribal members that work for each department in the state of Minnesota, for all 22 departments. Because of our working relationship with the governor, and we have the first Native American lieutenant governor in the country with Peggy Flanagan. She's a white earth enrollee. But what we're trying to do is, because our history isn't taught in schools, not in Minnesota anyway, I'm not sure about, I heard Montana's doing Indian education, but people don't know about tribes, and we're going around educating. We had a great day last week where we, the 11 tribal leaders, had Sovereignty Day, which was initiated by the Speaker of the House in Minnesota. And we had our legislators from the House and the Senate side take a day and learn about the 11 Indian tribes in Minnesota. And it was a really great event. That's the second time we've done it, but we're always trying to educate and get tribal representation in the state. And so by building those relationships and keep reiterating to your senators, your legislators, your counties, Leech Lake is going to be presenting, I believe, tomorrow, and they have a great relationship with their county. They meet with the county commissioners. It takes two. I realize that, and sometimes some counties are not very good with tribes. Sometimes some other agencies aren't very good with tribes. But I just say keep trying, because until those doors are knocked down, we're going to have to keep fighting, and it shouldn't be that way. But we should go side by side and get things worked out that benefits everybody, because we're dual citizens of we're dual citizens of our states. We vote in the state elections as well as our tribal elections, so we're dual citizens, and we have that right. So don't let them forget that. That's all I can say. So, gee, miigwech for attending our session, and I hope anything is helpful for you guys, and really appreciate seeing all of you. Miigwech.
Thank you. Yeah, the question, it's a great question. The question was, given the sort of the shortened timeline, 18 months for the conveyances of the property, what did the due diligence look like in terms of appraisals, title commitments, especially in the fact that it was during COVID? How did the sort of the transaction occur in such a shortened timeline, with still due diligence, making sure that the conveyances and the transaction was all taken care of the way it needed to be?
Sure. Thanks for the question. The Conservation Fund had purchased all this land from Potlatch in 2020, so we had all the title work and the policies, so we had that done. We knew we needed an appraisal, and we had been working with Potlatch in the state for about 12 years prior to the big acquisition of the 70,000 acres of what they had left. So we knew appraisers, so we jumped on it and asked for a quick turnaround on that. And then we shared that appraisal with Cris and his team, and Jeff and the legal team. So we were just really open about all of that from the very beginning, and we just jumped on it. And my colleague is here, Emily Nelson, here in the audience as well. And there's two of us in the state of Minnesota, and we just hit it, and we worked on it. And I think there was just cooperation all around to get this thing done. Cris, did you want to say anything about what you guys had to do?
Well, we don't have to do much. It's interesting. We make portfolio loans to the tribes on full faith and credit of the tribe's credit. So we look at 3 years of their audited financials. We look at what the overall intent is, and is the governance in place that works. But we don't need appraisals to do it. And we rely on, if the tribes want it, they know what it's worth. They've gone out and done the due diligence on the property. And so we can, I don't know, RJ, what do we turn loans around in 3 months or something? Sometimes even less than that. Yeah, we can do them pretty quick. But in this case, because the Conservation Fund was the go-between, they needed to have that. And so when it came to us, we were ready to go.
I think it's a great question. And I think, like Kim said, a lot of it was helped by the fact that the land had recently been acquired. And so there was recent title commitments and things that had been sort of vetted that we could look through, and Conservation Fund being transparent about those transaction documents. At the same time, there was a ton of work as well in terms of the deeds. I mean, deeds and legals and matching up and things like that for 28,000 plus acres, hundreds of parcels. Part of the due diligence was just a lot of time within that 18 months planning and prepping on at least the legal end in terms of getting ready to actually close on that stuff. So it's a super protracted timeline, but there was also a lot of hours like on our end in terms of just vetting, and a ton of it was helped by the work that had previously been done. And then there was a fair amount of work on the back end too, in terms of re-enrolling all the land in the CFA program. There was work to be done to do that. There was work to enroll some lands that weren't enrolled in the CFA program already. So there was additional applications that needed to be done. So even after closing, it's not really, it was, not due diligence in terms of the closing for it, but sort of the work that needed to be done after the fact. Some corrective deeds here and there because you're going to miss some stuff in that many conveyances. So yeah, there was, on the one hand, a lot of help with the Conservation Fund in the prior transaction, and on the other hand, a lot of hours as well and a lot of work.
Because it's state land, We will be paying taxes on that, and the taxes are very minimal. I forgot to mention that. But we will still have the ability to, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Legal Eagle here, we will still have the ability to say who can or can't hunt on that land because we own that land. Correct.
Right. Yeah. So it's all the land purchased from the conservation fund is all in fee status right now. It's not in trust status. So under the CFA program, it's maintained in fee status, and will be maintained in that status for as long as the CFA covenant exists until the council decides to move it into trust, likely after the loan is paid off. So, but the tribe, it's on reservation fee land, so the tribe can exercise pretty broad and significant jurisdiction over that land in terms of application of hunting and fishing and gathering and things like that. Really close for DNR purposes to what it would exercise over trust land.
Hold on, one more thing. One problem area we're running into is because we got this additional land, it's additional workload for our DNR and natural resources staff, and we're not getting the funding from the federal government for that because of that. So we're going to be looking for additional funding resources to help oversee that additional 28,000. So that might be like a drawback with that.
I think early on, I guess maybe I was taking more of a hard approach than the band was comfortable with. Let me put it that way. I thought the CFA program says non-Indian or the public can have access to fish and wildlife. And I suggested that the language be, well, they can come take pictures of it. And Joe Halloran wrote some crafty language that left it open to the public, but under the band's regulations and rules. And that then can say when the seasons are open and closed, and actually work toward the tribe's sovereignty relative to the state. So it worked out that way.
So there was a good segue into my question, and that was about placing the land into trust. And knowing that there's some time to kind of build that up, and I think all the land is in Couchiching County through this purchase? Okay. Wondering how and if, and you probably are working on plans to kind of work with those counties to let them know that eventually, assuming the Bois Forte Band will put the land into trust, and just if there's any kind of pushback or any cooperation would be the better thing to hear from those counties.
Currently, there is no pushback from the counties. Couchiching County is pretty quiet with us. Net Lake, the village of Net Lake actually is split a little bit with one road to the right is Couch County, and to the left is St. Louis County. And so Couch County has a small piece in the village, but with St. Louis County, we have a better relationship with St. Louis County because we know the people on the county board. We actually invited and had a meeting with our county commissioner, and he had the first ever St. Louis County commissioners meeting on the reservation at our casino, and invited everybody there. And we had a meet and greet dinner the night before, met with the county auditor and all, because the staff for St. Louis County live 100 miles away from us. So again, it's about an education process for getting those partnerships in place. And I know that the county is very supportive of the tribe because this land is within our boundaries. And they are learning the education, they are learning about the boarding school era, they are learning about the Allotment Act. One thing that Minnesota does that's been very helpful is that we've had what's called tribal state relations training. It actually started out with the Minnesota Department of Transportation, but it's now required in law for all state employees to take that training, because it talks about the Trail of Tears. It's a timeline. It's about all Indian law that has happened to the tribes to try to eradicate us and get rid of us. And so all state employees are required to take that because when they're working with the tribes have to be at the table and be at the forefront. So for those of you in other states, get that, if you can, and have a chance, try to see if you can get that type of training for anybody. We've done county commissioners, we've done state employees, we did the House of Representatives at Bois Forte. We want to look at educators now, teachers, because they don't even know our history. So we're looking at, and county social workers. So we're looking at trying to educate everybody because nobody knows. And then when they come out of that training, it's like, wow, I never knew. They don't know. They know about everybody else but us. And so tribal state relations training, if you have a chance, you can look it up in the state of Minnesota. It's a wonderful educational piece to get those agencies trained. So with that county commissioner issue, it's worked good. Some tribes have a lot of issues with other counties, but it's a start. If we don't start, we aren't going to get anywhere.
As part of your land, utilizing these forests, is part of your, as part of the development for economic drive, going to filter down to your tribal membership to revitalize those practices, traditional practices, or making, and how much of that, how much of that is, are you investing in types of programs like that for those traditional lifeways? Because I know that your people, we're Lake people, how are you implementing that as part of your development for your membership?
Well, as we all know, we're all trying to get our language and culture back because it was taken from us. And we are in the process of trying to, well, actually, right now at Bois Forte, we only have 2 fluent speakers left. We lost 3 during COVID, and so we're really struggling. But what we're trying to do is incorporate that language and culture back. Funding it, first of all, because there's a lot of money that's coming through for language and cultural revitalization. We've hired our own, we have our own Heritage Center director who's a University of Minnesota graduate, very young man that's very knowledgeable about the culture and language. We've hired another young man, and why I say young is because these young men are going to build that culture and that language as the years go on. We've hired another Ojibwe language and culture coordinator. We also have a young man that works at our fitness centers that is incorporating our culture with going ricing, how to be in a canoe. We net walleye in the spring. We have netting classes for our children. We also have an elder that is on our KBFT, our public radio, doing educational words of the day or sentences of the day. We've got a regalia. We've been doing a lot of cultural programs. We don't have the funding from this project to do that, but we do have funding sources from other agencies to get that known, because we do have a lot of work to do with that. Especially in the traditional medicine area, we're losing so many elders with that. So, but we're also recording it, because with the technology nowadays, we have that ability to do that. So that's what we're doing. And getting our stories, our traditional stories from our elders as well.
So I was just going to respond to the first the question about working with the counties. We have a message runner. That's the publication we do occasionally. We have a message runner around that, where we've given a couple of examples of when the tribes and counties work together. And then we have a couple of examples of when the tribes and counties don't work together. I think some of you know in the latter, that would be Oneida and Hobart, and in the former, one of it was the Wisconsin Transportation Department, and it goes along the lines of the Minnesota piece. Is how do you start finding those entry points with the state and counties where you find the friendly, curious voice that you start working with and ultimately grow it out from there. It's a slow process, but it's sure a lot better than ending up in court every other week or scrapping around continually over little things that really don't make that much difference. Then when you get to a point where you can't get over that, we've done projects in the past where we looked at what does the county really get in taxes and from whom. And often in the one we did in a western state, the tribe won't they won't let us release the information about it because they, even after now almost 16 years, they still use it politically every time a new county commissioner comes in. They use it to inform them that the tribe is actually about 50% of their tax revenue, despite more land going into trust all the time. And so they begin to realize that the tribes, there is a long time attitude that the tribes are black holes to money. And the reality is that whole power dynamic is shifting, and the tribes are economic engines in a lot of places. And so you have to be able to point those things out to folks over time. But that's how you get started.
I think we'll end about 10 minutes early. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and yeah, appreciate it.